Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Before we begin, get comfortable. If you're already settled in, take a few moments to relax, breathe deeply, and let all the pressure of the day evaporate. Take a moment to enjoy this fascinating story, which will immerse you in one of the most tragic and mysterious tales in Russian history. If you enjoy what you hear, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're new here, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always great to know where each member of the community joins us from. Tonight, I invite you to discover the story of the Romanovs, a royal family whose rise and fall marked the country's history in a brutal way. A family that reigned for 3 centuries but met a tragic and mysterious end, full of mysteries and rumors. So, settle in comfortably, and let me take you through the history of this fascinating family and their curse that seems to have struck this imperial dynasty. The story of the Romanovs begins in 1613, at a crucial moment in Russian history. Russia was going through a period of chaos after the end of the Rurikid dynasty, a period known as the Time of Troubles. These were years of civil war, power struggles, and internal divisions. It was in this context that a young noble, Michael Romanov, was elected Tsar of Russia by the boyars, a powerful nobility seeking to restore order in the country. Michael Romanov was not an obvious Tsar candidate, but his rise to power was a turning point. He became a central figure in devastated Russia, and his accession to the throne marked the beginning of a long dynasty. Initially, Michael had to face numerous rebellions, but he gradually managed to establish himself as a sovereign capable of reunifying the country. The real turning point came with the rise of Peter the Great, a Tsar determined to transform Russia. Peter the Great was not just an authoritarian monarch, but a visionary reformer. He saw Russia as an empire lagging behind the great European powers and did everything to change that. He founded St. Petersburg, the new capital, and radically modified the structure of the army, education, and even society itself. Peter the Great forced the Russian nobility to adopt European ways of life, imposing sometimes brutal reforms to modernize the empire. These changes did not happen without resistance. Many aristocrats, who felt stripped of their traditional privileges, opposed his reforms, fueling growing discontent. Peter, however, would not back down from anything. His reforms and vision made Russia a great power, but they also caused deep divisions. Peter was not content with internal reforms. In 1700, he launched into the Great Northern War against Sweden, a war that would define Russia's future. His victory allowed Russia to take control of the Baltic Sea, thus opening the way to increased international trade and growing influence on the European scene. However, although Peter was a visionary man, he was nonetheless a complex figure, sometimes ruthless. His ability to impose his reforms in an authoritarian manner and his indifference to his subjects' suffering created tension within the empire itself. Despite the progress he made in modernizing Russia, Peter left behind a deeply divided society, marked by social inequalities and power struggles. Peter the Great's reforms would have lasting effects on Russia, but they also laid the groundwork for numerous internal tensions. Peter's legacy is therefore dual, a legacy of greatness and power, but also a legacy of internal divisions that, over time, would end up weakening the Romanov regime. The legend of the Romanov curse takes shape well after Michael Romanov's death. The story says that in 1614, a Polish princess named Marina Mniszek cast a curse on the Romanovs after the death of her suitor, a man who had a claim to the throne. This curse seems to manifest itself through the centuries, linking to the family's tragic events. Every premature death, every assassination, and every catastrophe seems to confirm this idea that the Romanovs were doomed to a tragic fate. The first significant event of this curse occurred under the reign of Peter II, a Tsar who lived only 14 years before dying mysteriously. Although natural reasons were given for his death, rumors of the curse spread, and his premature disappearance was seen by many as the first sign of the Romanovs' dire fate. The tragedies continued. Alexander II, nicknamed the Reformist Tsar, was assassinated in 1881. His assassination, violating the promise of a brighter future for Russia, revived the belief that the Romanovs were under a curse. But it was under Nicholas II, the last Tsar, that the curse seemed to strike with full force. Nicholas II's reign was marked by internal conflicts, popular revolts, and military crises that considerably weakened the imperial regime. Nicholas II was a pious man, deeply attached to his family. But the rise of revolution and internal troubles in Russia weakened his position. The impact of World War I, coupled with the suffering of the Russian people, accentuated the Tsar's disastrous situation. Every attempt at reform was perceived as too little, too late. But beyond political crises, it was in the family context that the curse seemed to manifest most painfully. Nicholas II's son, Alexis, suffered from hemophilia, a rare genetic disease that prevents blood clotting, and condemned him to constant suffering. The imperial couple turned to mystical solutions, particularly Rasputin, a man whose reputation as a healer attracted Alexandra. The relationship with Rasputin, which intensified over the years, became a major point of tension at court. Rasputin, although a controversial figure criticized by Russian elites, exerted growing influence on the imperial family. In his eyes, he possessed mystical powers that could save Tsarism. However, his growing influence created mistrust among the nobles and fueled plots aimed at eliminating him. The curse that struck the Romanovs seemed to strengthen with the entry of this enigmatic figure into their lives. Under Nicholas II's reign, Russia went through moments of great instability. Nicholas II, a respected but often perceived as weak Tsar, faced massive internal challenges. His authoritarianism was not sufficient to contain social tensions and growing divisions in the empire. The people suffered from war privations and the declining economy. Revolts multiplied, and strikes became frequent in major cities. In 1905, a revolt broke out after a massacre of peaceful demonstrators during what is called Bloody Sunday. The revolt was harshly suppressed, but it marked the beginning of increasingly great discontent with Tsarism. The October Manifesto, which granted limited reforms and freedoms, failed to appease tensions. On the contrary, it seemed to worsen the situation. The people demanded more freedoms and social reforms, but Nicholas II remained stuck in a policy of resistance to change. The Tsar was also a man prey to personal struggles. His family, although united, faced immense challenges, mainly because of their son Alexis's illness. The latter, suffering from hemophilia, was a constant burden for his parents, who desperately sought a remedy. The relationship with Rasputin became increasingly problematic, especially when the latter seemed to have too much influence on the imperial family. Family struggles merged with political crises, and Russia slowly sank into chaos. Tsarism became increasingly unpopular, and the power of the Romanov family, once uncontested, was now increasingly fragile. When World War I broke out in 1914, Russia, although immense and rich in human resources, was poorly prepared to face this global conflict. Tsar Nicholas II found himself at the head of an empire exhausted by decades of difficult reforms, growing internal tensions, and deep divisions within society. The war only worsened the suffering of the Russian people, who endured terrible military losses and severe food shortages. Men were sent to the fronts, but the Russian army was poorly equipped and poorly led. Nicholas II personally took command of the armed forces, but his decisions proved catastrophic. In 1916, as military defeats followed one another and troop morale collapsed, popular discontent grew. The war, associated with shortages and military failures, plunged Russia into unprecedented chaos. The Tsar, isolated and disconnected from his people, became an increasingly unpopular figure. Protests against Tsarism multiplied. The Romanov curse seemed to crystallize as the Russian Empire approached its fall. The fate of the imperial family, already marked by tragedies and suffering, approached the point of no return. Rumors of their misfortune spread, and part of the Russian people now considered that the end of the Romanovs was imminent. Events took a dramatic turn in February 1917, when demonstrations broke out in the streets of Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. War, famine, and the people's indigence reached a critical threshold. Workers, soldiers, and peasants rose up against an imperial system that seemed no longer able to respond to their needs. On March 8, February 23, according to the Julian calendar used in Russia, the first strikes began, and the next day, demonstrations multiplied in the city. Strikers and soldiers gathered to demand an end to the war and the introduction of political reforms. Quickly, these riots transformed into a large-scale revolution. Demonstrators demanded the Tsar's resignation and the end of autocratic government. On the 15th of March, 1917, Nicholas II, trapped by the situation, abdicated in favor of his brother Michael Romanov, who refused the throne. Russia thus found itself without a Tsar, and the Romanov dynasty collapsed, marking a major turning point in the country's history. It was a fatal blow for the imperial family and, in particular, for Nicholas II, who saw his empire collapse before his eyes. The Romanov curse seemed to finally fully realize itself. After 3 centuries of power, the Tsar dynasty ended in a humiliating and precipitated abdication. After the abdication, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their children were first placed under a form of surveillance at Tsarskoye Selo, their former imperial residence. However, the situation soon deteriorated. As political upheavals intensified and the revolution gained momentum, the Romanovs were transferred to Yekaterinburg, a city located in the Ural Mountains, far from the centers of power. There, they were imprisoned in a house under close surveillance by the Bolshevik authorities. Despite their increasingly degraded living conditions, the members of the imperial family, and especially Nicholas II and Alexandra, continued to cling to their royal status and dignity. But the curse seemed to still hang over them, particularly over Alexis, who suffered from hemophilia. At each stage of their captivity, this family's suffering continued to increase, and palpable tension settled among the Bolsheviks, who found themselves facing a dilemma: what to do with the last members of the imperial family. The decision to end the Romanovs' lives was made on the night of the 16th of July, 1918. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, believed that the imperial family constituted a threat to the revolution and too strong a symbol of the monarchical past. They ordered their execution, marking the tragic end of a dynasty of more than 3 centuries. The family was taken to the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, where a group of Bolshevik soldiers awaited them. Nicholas II, Alexandra, their 5 children, as well as several servants, were all shot mercilessly. The bodies were then buried in a mass grave, in a secret location, hidden from the rest of the world. The brutality of the execution was a symbolic act, meant to erase all trace of the Russian imperial past. But this bloody act, far from ending the rumors and mysteries, only reinforced the legend of the Romanov curse. After their execution, rumors began to circulate. Anastasia's body was not found immediately, and for years, people claimed to have seen the young Tsarina alive. The most famous of them was Anna Anderson, who spent years claiming she was Anastasia. These stories fed the mystery around the end of the Romanovs and gave birth to a survival myth. The curse, far from stopping with the imperial family's assassination, seemed to be prolonged by this mystery. The question of whether one of the Tsar's daughters had survived remained without a definitive answer for many decades. It was only in 2007, with the exhumation of the Romanov remains and DNA analysis, that the truth came out. All family members were killed that night. But even with scientific confirmation, the legend of Anastasia persists. This mystery, although resolved, became an additional symbol of the curse that weighed on the Romanov family. Thus concludes the story of the Romanovs, marked by a curse that seems to have weighed on every generation of this royal family. From the first curse cast by Marina Mniszek in 1614 to Nicholas II's abdication and the bloody execution of the family in 1918, the Romanov dynasty embodies tragedy and dire fate. But even after their death, their story continues to haunt the collective imagination. The Romanov curse did not just mark the end of an empire. It became a legend, a mystery, and an essential element of the narrative of Russian history.